The vote to exile Earth was approved. Then humanity made their terms clear. The tally board turned blue at 14:07 Conclave Standard Time, and I watched it the way you watch a car slide on ice. You see it happening. You understand exactly what it is. You do not flinch because flinching changes nothing. 847 to 1. I was sitting behind a pane of treated glass on the fifth-floor observer's gallery, separated from the main chamber floor by a wall the Veth Secretariat had quietly installed 3 years prior. They said it was atmospheric regulation. Human respiration produced carbon ratios incompatible with the conclave's environmental standards for the central chamber. I had thanked them for the consideration. I had never once mentioned that I had spent 8 previous years sitting in that same chamber, without a single recorded atmospheric incident. The glass was not about atmosphere. I understood that. I let them have it anyway. Below me, 5,000 square feet of conclave architecture performed its centuries-old function. 12 rings of representative platforms, each one elevated and coded to a species block. The Caliph Dominion in the outer ring, 200 species clustered around their senior, delegates the way smaller fish cluster near something larger and meaner, waiting, as they always waited, to vote the way the loudest voice in the room voted, the Veth Collective in the inner ring. And between them, every other species that had ever found its way into this chamber, and decided that belonging to the conclave was better than the alternative. It takes a long time to count 847 votes. I had time to drink my coffee. It was cold before the third block finished, but I kept drinking it because cold coffee is still coffee, and I had learned years ago not to waste things that were available. Earth's vote came last. Protocol required a formal response from the accused party. I had one seat in the observer's gallery, one panel with one button, and a microphone that I had tested the evening before and confirmed was set to a volume that would not carry past the first row of the observer's section. I pressed the button anyway. No. The tally locked, 847 to 1. The chamber broke into 17 different simultaneous frequencies of approval, each species registering its satisfaction in its own way, and the combined sound landed somewhere between a cathedral organ and the pressure shift before a thunderstorm. It had no human equivalent. It filled the space below me and rattled lightly against the glass. I looked down at my hand on the railing. Still. Both hands completely still. I had expected something different. I had prepared, in quiet privacy, a small script for the moment the board locked, a set of instructions to myself about breathing, about composure, about the specific discipline required to not let 11 years of work show on your face when it lands on the floor in front of you. I had prepared for my hands to shake. They did not shake. I thought about Iris. I opened that door for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. The way you crack a window in winter to check if it is raining, and you get your answer, and you close it again because you already know what coat you are going to wear regardless of what the weather does. I closed the door. Councillor Rien of the Veth Collective was the author of the exile motion. He had been Veth's lead representative for 6 years, long enough that I knew his schedule, his preferences, and the way he tilted his forward-facing optical cluster slightly right when he was choosing his words carefully. He had, at 3 separate formal functions, referred to me as a colleague, not an observer, not a visitor, a colleague. I had noted each instance. I had also noted that he never looked directly at the glass when he passed the observer's gallery, not once in 3 years. After the vote locked, he rotated his platform. He looked up. I smiled at him. Not the working smile. Every diplomat has a working smile. It is as much a professional tool as a pen or a prepared statement. What I gave him was not that. It was the other kind, the kind that lives in the eyes but does not warm them. My grandmother used that smile in church when someone spoke too loudly about things they did not understand. She aimed it the way you aim something. I aimed it at Councillor Rien through the glass. He held my gaze for 4 seconds. He looked away first. I set down my empty coffee cup. Owen Clark was 2 seats to my left. 34 years old, 3 years with the delegation. He had come to this post because he was genuinely good at finding middle ground in rooms that had decided there was none, a quality I valued the same way I valued a good umbrella. You hope you do not need it constantly, but you are glad it exists. He was staring at the tally board with the expression of a man who had just watched a bridge he built collapse into a river. I let him sit with it for a moment. That is something I have learned to do. Some information requires a moment before a person is ready to do anything useful with it. Then I stood up and straightened my jacket. "Come on," I said quietly. He looked at me. "Ambassador." "I know," I said. We walked out, down the corridor, into the access lift, past the conclave security staff positioned at the transfer bay who watch the human delegation the way you watch something that has not caused a problem yet but seems like the type that eventually would, into the shuttle bay where our vessel sat. I buckled in. Owen sat across from me. He was building a question. I could see it. He was assembling it with care, the way you handle something that might break. "They didn't debate it," he said finally. "No. The Meridian Independence." He said the name like it had a weight he was still adjusting to. Grace spent 3 years on the Meridian Outreach Program, 3 years of relationship building. They voted yes, all 17 of them. They did. Without hesitation. "Owen." I turned from the window and looked at him directly. "I am going to say one thing, and then we are going to move forward and not revisit it." He waited. The Meridian Independents voted the way they voted because they made a calculation. They weighed the value of standing with Earth against the cost of opposing the Veth Collective. The math produced the answer it produced. That is not betrayal. That is a calculation. And a calculation is something you can work with, because a calculation tells you exactly what a party values and exactly what it fears. Silence. "You cannot be surprised by a calculation," I said. "You can only be unprepared for one." The shuttle lifted. The Centrum building shrank through the window, all that architecture, all that history, all 400 years of accumulated conclave certainty made small by altitude. I watched it until it was the size of a coin. Then I looked away and opened a file on my tablet. I had kept it for 8 years. The header had never changed because changing it would have meant believing there was a version of events in which I did not need it. The file was called Terms. I started reading. 31 FTL relay lanes, none of them registered in any conclave database, each one operational and tested, curved across the dark between us and the 12 species that nobody in that chamber below had bothered to take seriously. My hands were still. The shuttle cleared the upper atmosphere. The stars came back. All of them. The Exile instrument arrived in my inbox 3 days after the vote, formatted in conclave standard script with a human-readable translation attached as a secondary document, as though the conclave was doing us a favor by including it. I read it over breakfast on the 3rd morning. Toast. Real butter. I had packed 6 months of real butter in the delegation's food stores before leaving Earth, which my logistics coordinator Colin Bates had flagged as excessive, and I had overruled on the grounds that some details are not negotiable. Colin had made a note in the manifest. I had made a note to stop explaining myself to manifests. The Exile instrument was 47 pages long. It had 11 subsections, 4 appendices, and a preamble that took 3 pages to say what could have been said in 1 paragraph. I appreciated that. It told me exactly how confident the writers were in what they had produced, confident enough to be generous with the word count, confident enough to leave space around their conclusions. That kind of confidence has a shape. I had been watching it for 11 years. The terms, stripped of the preamble and the procedural padding, were these. All 14 FTL relay lanes connecting Earth's system to the conclave's communication and transit network would be decommissioned within 90 conclave days. Conclave personnel would conduct the decommissioning. Earth's cooperation was assumed, but its consent was listed as optional, which was the kind of diplomatic phrasing that meant something very specific about how the conclave viewed the power dynamic in this conversation. The trade embargo covered 612 member species, representing, by the conclave's own economic modeling, 89% of known interstellar commercial activity. All contracts currently active between Earth-registered entities and conclave member species would be suspended pending review. The review timeline was unspecified. The office responsible for conducting reviews was not named. Earth's territorial recognition under the conclave's jurisdiction framework would be revoked. Legally, under conclave law, the Sol system would cease to exist as a protected territory. Any vessel, any species, any entity operating in Sol system space after the revocation date would not be subject to conclave rules of engagement. The document described this as a natural consequence of voluntary departure from the framework. It used the phrase voluntary departure, without any visible self-consciousness. And the communication blackout. No conclave-relayed signals in or out. No diplomatic channels. No emergency broadcast access. 90 days of grace period during which Earth could put its affairs in order, and then a silence that the instrument described as complete and indefinite. I read all 47 pages. I ate my toast. I went back and read Section 7. Section 7 was titled Prior Incidents, Exclusions from Humanitarian Review. It was 4 paragraphs long and largely procedural. It established that incidents occurring before the formal exile date would not be revisited under any future humanitarian framework. It listed relevant cases by their conclave registration numbers. Case number KL7741GI. No name, just the number. That was the case number they had assigned to the incident that I had agreed 11 years ago to describe as a navigation error. The incident the conclave had investigated and closed in 6 weeks because the Veth Collective had provided their own operational logs, and the review board had accepted them without independent verification and marked the matter resolved. Case number KL7741GI, listed in a footnote, in an exclusion clause. I read it twice. I took a long sip of my coffee. Then I went to the communications room, where Nora Webb was managing our encrypted channels. Nora had been with the delegation for 5 years and had the particular quality of understanding when a room required silence. She looked at my face, said nothing, and turned the other direction. I sat down at the primary terminal. I sent one encrypted message to Earth, 3 words. Start the clock. Then I went back to my toast. Owen was in the main briefing room when I arrived 2 hours later. He had a printed copy of the instrument on the table, and the expression of someone who had been staring at the same paragraph long enough to lose the meaning of individual words. Grace Adler was across from him, running something on her tablet. She was 38, had been with the delegation longer than Owen, and had the enviable quality of processing bad news without any visible intermediary step. It arrived, she absorbed it, she moved forward. Hal Morton was standing by the window. Hal was technically our security coordinator, practically our everything that does not fit another category coordinator. He had the build of someone who had played collegiate sport and the bearing of someone who had long since decided that patience was more efficient than any other approach. He had been with me since the beginning. He was one of 4 people in this room who knew everything. Close the door, I said. Owen closed it. I sat at the head of the table and set the instrument in front of me, face down. I am going to explain some things, I said. Some of you know parts of what I am going to say. Some of you know none of it. I need everyone in this room to understand all of it before we proceed, because we are now operating in a different situation than we were 4 days ago. Gray stopped typing. The Exile instrument, I said, is built on an assumption. The assumption is that Earth's capacity to function without the conclave network is effectively 0. That every system we use, our FTL transit, our interstellar communications, our trade, our territorial protection, is either conclave infrastructure or conclave licensed technology. And that without access to those things, Earth's position reduces to one inhabited planet, one star system, and no meaningful ability to project influence, conduct commerce, or defend its interests at interstellar scale. I paused. That assumption, I said, is not correct. Owen looked up from the table. I let that land for a moment. The 14 relay lanes they intend to decommission are the Conclave's relay lanes. They were built on Conclave infrastructure, they operate on Conclave standards, and the Conclave has every right to shut them down. They are going to shut them down. I have no objection to that. Grace looked up now. Those 14 lanes represent the Conclave's access to Earth, I said. They do not represent Earth's access to anything, because we have not been using the Conclave's network exclusively for 8 years. The room was very quiet. I picked up my tablet and put a star map on the shared display screen at the far wall, a standard-looking chart, Sol's system at the center, relay infrastructure radiating outward. The Conclave's version of this map had 14 lanes. Mine had 31. Owen's chair scraped the floor slightly. He had not moved. The sound was just the room adjusting. We built them to a different specification than Conclave standard, I said. The first 2 were permitted. We applied for supplementary navigational support infrastructure 8 years ago. The application was reviewed and approved, and the buoys were built. What the Conclave's monitoring systems were not designed to flag was that the specification we used was not Conclave-derived. The signature is different. Their sensors read it as background noise. 8 years, Owen said. The remaining 29 were built over the following 6 years, filed under the same designations, installed in the same manner. The Conclave's translation matrix rendered the filing category as navigational support infrastructure every time, which is the kind of thing that only happens when you understand how a translation matrix prioritizes categories and you design your documentation accordingly. Who approved this? Owen asked. The relevant authorities on Earth, I said. He was quiet for a moment. You recommended it. I did not confirm or deny that. I moved on. The trade embargo covers 612 Conclave member species, I said. It does not cover species that are not Conclave members. Over the past 6 years, Earth has developed active trade relationships with 18 non-member species. These are species that the Conclave categorizes as peripheral, young civilizations, resource-developing economies, not yet at the stage where Conclave membership would benefit them enough to seek it. The Conclave considers them economically irrelevant. I paused. They are not irrelevant, I said. They have materials we needed. We had technology they needed. We did not begin those relationships as a contingency plan. We began them because they were good relationships. The contingency is that they produce a situation where an embargo covering 89% of known economic activity leaves Earth with 11% intact, and 11% of interstellar trade is not nothing. It is more than enough to sustain active commercial operations, while we renegotiate the other 89. Grace said, "You knew this vote was coming." I knew it was possible, I said. For how long? I looked at the star map on the wall, 31 lanes. Long enough, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. Then she wrote something on her tablet and went back to work. Owen had both hands flat on the table. He was doing the arithmetic that people do when they are realigning a timeline in their head. I watched him do it. The Conclave thinks they're exiling us into silence, he said finally. Yes. They're exiling us into a network we built while they weren't paying attention. That is one way to describe it. He was quiet again. What does start the clock mean? He asked. I looked at him. It means we have 30 days before we respond, I said. I stood up, picked up my tablet, turned off the star map. The screen went dark. I want everyone rested, I said. Eat dinner, sleep. Tomorrow we start preparing the document. Nobody asked which document. That was how I knew my team understood the situation. The briefing took 4 hours. I stood at the display screen for most of it. I do not like sitting for presentations. Sitting is for conversations. Standing is for information that needs to go somewhere specific and arrive intact. Owen had his notebook open. He takes written notes. Real paper, real pen. He told me once that typing feels like an intermediary step between thinking and recording, and he prefers to remove the intermediary. I had considered that observation and decided it was probably true for him and worth respecting. Grace had her tablet. Hal had nothing. Hal never takes notes. He absorbs information without visible effort, the way certain materials absorb sound, and then has it available when it becomes relevant 6 months later. Drew Farr sat at the far end of the table. Drew was our technical infrastructure analyst. He was quiet and angular and worked with the kind of concentrated focus that made the people around him unconsciously lower their voices. He was 31 years old, recruited straight out of a doctoral program in distributed network systems, and he understood the relay infrastructure better than anyone in the room except possibly me. 31 lanes, Drew said, when I put the map back on the screen. 31. He studied the map the way you study something you are surprised to see fully assembled. He knew about the lanes. He had helped build the specifications for 6 of them, but seeing all 31 charted at once, with their full reach, produced an expression on his face that I found professionally satisfying. The conclave's monitoring coverage does not reach the third quadrant waypoints, he said. No. Which is where 8 of these originate. Correct. He leaned back slowly. They genuinely do not know, he said. They have no reason to know, I said. Their infrastructure maps what their infrastructure touches. These lanes do not touch their infrastructure. This is the thing about operating inside a system that has existed long enough to believe it is comprehensive. The system stops checking for things outside itself. 400 years of successful expansion produces an architecture of assumptions. Every new species that joins the conclave joins on conclave terms, uses conclave technology, routes through conclave lanes. The idea that a new species might build its own parallel infrastructure, not in defiance, not with any announcement, just quietly, carefully for 8 years, sits outside the architecture of what the conclave expects. I had understood this from the first year. The 18 trade partners, I continued. Drew, take them through the tier structure. Drew pulled up a secondary display. 18 species, each one mapped by resource category, technology exchange value, and current trade volume with Earth. He walked through them methodically. Raw mineral extraction from the Gareth system, atmospheric processing compounds from the Vela, biological textile materials from species the conclave had surveyed 7 years ago and filed under non-priority development. Owen was writing steadily. What is the combined economic output of the 18 partners relative to the conclave embargo impact? He asked. 14% of pre-embargo volume, Drew said, which sounds limited on its own, but it is 14% that does not require conclave routing, conclave authorization, or conclave standard vessels. It moves through our lanes. It settles through our agreements. And 3 of the 18 partners have expressed interest in formalizing the relationship into something more structured. How structured? Grace asked. I answered that one. A framework, an alternative framework, not a competing entity. We are not building a counter-conclave. What we are building is the infrastructure for a different kind of relationship between species that have decided the current option is not working for them. Grace sat with that for a moment. That is a significant thing to say out loud. I am saying it in a locked room to 4 people. We have time to be precise about language before we say it in larger rooms. Hal spoke. It was the first time he had spoken in 2 hours. Tell them about the ships, he said. I looked at him. He was looking at the table. Then he looked at me and his face was neutral, which is Hal's version of saying, "This matters, say it directly." I looked at the room. Over the past 4 years, I said, Earth has maintained a distributed presence of vessels throughout non-conclave deep space. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. These are not combat vessels. They are long-range survey and support ships, running standard scientific and logistical operations on publicly filed missions. There is nothing unusual about a species running deep space survey operations. The conclave does it constantly. How many vessels? Owen asked. Enough, I said. He looked at me steadily. I need a number, Ambassador. You need to know it is enough, I said. The specific number is not what matters. The position is what matters. And the position is this. At every significant navigational choke point in the deep space sectors the conclave has categorized as unoccupied and unmonitored, there is a human vessel, not threatening anyone, not doing anything that requires an explanation, just present. The room absorbed that. Present the way a key is present in a lock, Hal said quietly. I looked at him. That is one way to put it. Owen put down his pen. He set it on the notebook and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. How long have you known this was coming? He asked. This was the second time he had asked a version of this question. The first time I had given him the answer that was technically sufficient. He was asking for the complete one now. I was quiet for a moment. Iris died on the 14th of March, I said, 12 years ago. The conclave reviewed the incident and closed the file in 6 weeks. I agreed to the language they used. I agreed to the case number. I agreed to the framing, and I went back to work, and I spent the next 3 years building relationships with the Meridian Independents because that was what the job required. Nobody moved. 3 weeks after the file was closed, I said, I wrote a document. It was not an official document. It was not filed anywhere. It was a private assessment of the structural vulnerabilities in Earth's relationship with the conclave, what we depended on that we should not, what we had not built that we needed, what the conclave would do to us if it ever decided we were not worth the inconvenience of maintaining. I picked up the tablet. I put the star map back on the screen. 31 lanes. I kept updating it, I said. Every year. Every new piece of information about conclave internal politics, about species on the periphery, about infrastructure gaps and non-member civilizations. Every year I updated it, and then I sent it to the people on Earth who needed to read it. And they read it. Owen's pen was still on the notebook. And they built what it said to build, he said. They built most of it, I said. Some of it I did not anticipate. They were thorough. Grace was looking at the star map. Her expression had the quality of someone reassessing a long sequence of events and rereading each one now with different information. The conclave thinks they are sending us home, she said. They think home is a punishment. Yes, I said. I turned off the display. Prepare the document, I said. I want a complete draft of the terms within 48 hours. Drew, you handle the infrastructure language. Grace, the trade framework. Owen, the diplomatic architecture. Hal, the positioning section. I will write the opening and the closing. I picked up my jacket. One more thing, I said. They looked at me. In the document, there is a clause that comes first. Before the relay lanes, before the trade framework, before the positioning and the alternative partnership infrastructure. The first clause is about a case number in the conclave's archive. Section 7, Clause 4, KL7741GI. Owen was very still. That clause will correct the record. The incident will be identified by its accurate description and by name. That is non-negotiable. It is first. It is not explained. It is not contextualized. It is stated as fact because it is fact, and the conclave will accept it as such, or they will explain to me in writing exactly why they prefer their case number. I buttoned my jacket. 48 hours, I said, go. The walk from the ship's docking bay to the conclave centrum's main floor was 11 minutes at a normal pace. I took 14. Not because I was nervous, because 14 minutes at that particular pace, in that particular corridor, communicated something that no prepared statement could. When you are arriving to speak in the most powerful political chamber in known space, and you arrive at a comfortable pace instead of a hurried one, the room understands something about you before you have said a word. The request had gone through under Article 9 of the Conclave Charter, right of response. Every accused party, every species subject to conclave action, had the right to address the chamber before a decision became permanent. They had granted it the way you hand someone a form to fill out when you have already decided what to do with their file. A formality, a courtesy extended to something they expected to be brief. The charter did not specify how long a right of response address could be. I had checked. No upper limit. Owen was behind me. Grace was behind him. Hal was at the rear. Drew had stayed on the ship to manage communications. Nora Webb was monitoring every frequency the conclave used for internal coordination, because what gets said in the corridors before a session tells you more than what gets said on the floor during it. We came through the main access corridor into the chamber approach. There was no gallery today. Article 9 granted floor access, standing level, the same atmospheric mix as everyone else, the same acoustics, the same sight lines, the same microphone system at full broadcast volume. I was on the floor of the conclave chamber for the first time in 3 years. The chamber at floor level was different from the chamber as seen through glass. Larger. The rings of platforms rose around and above you. The geometry of the space was designed to make any single point at the center feel small and surrounded, a deliberate architectural choice made by people who wanted speakers to feel exactly that. The first time I had stood in this space as a junior diplomatic observer, 23 years ago, it had worked on me. The scale of it had pressed on my chest in a way I still remembered. It did not do that now. I set my folder on the speaker's surface, a physical folder, paper documents inside. Every person in the chamber had a digital display. They would be prepared for digital. The paper was about something else. The paper said, I printed this because I already know what it contains and intend to refer to it without searching a screen. Councillor Rien was in the inner ring. His platform was oriented toward the center by default, which meant it was oriented toward me. He had the quality of someone who is very good at projecting composure and was doing so with slightly more effort than usual today. I noted that. The chamber's presiding official, a tall member of the Caliph Dominion named Arbiter Voss, announced the session in 3 languages simultaneously, which the translation units converted for the remaining species. Then Arbiter Voss announced that Earth's delegation had invoked Article 9 and would address the chamber. I did not look up at the observers' gallery. Some people expected me to. There were 17 human observers behind the UV glass today, watching in the way you watch something you have a stake in. I did not look up because looking up would tell the room something about my state of mind, and my state of mind was not for the gallery. I looked at Arbiter Voss. I nodded. I opened my folder. The document I am presenting today, I said, speaking at a measured pace into the full broadcast microphone now transmitting my voice at full volume across the chamber, is titled, Terms of Continued Non-Aggression and Mutual Recognition, Earth's Proposal to the Galactic Conclave. I let that title sit for a moment, not a long moment, just long enough. These are not objections to the conclave's vote, I said. I want to be precise about that. The conclave voted. The process was followed. 847 member species voted to exile Earth from the conclave framework, and that vote was legal and properly recorded, and Earth acknowledges it. I turned to the first page. These are Earth's conditions for the manner in which that exile proceeds. The chamber noise shifted, not loudly, but present, the particular murmur that forms in a room full of intelligent creatures when something they were not expecting arrives. The first term, I said, concerns an item in the conclave's own archive. Section 7, the Prior Incidents Exclusion Clause, contains a case number, KL7741GI. This case was filed 11 years ago and closed within 6 weeks. The closing language describes the incident as a navigation error resulting in non-actionable loss. I turned a page. That language is incorrect. The incident was not a navigation error. The incident was the result of unauthorized VETH collective vessel activity in a protected transit corridor, during which a human civilian transport was struck and destroyed, resulting in the loss of 19 lives. The VETH Collective provided their own operational logs to the review board. The review board accepted them without independent verification and closed the case. I looked up from the document. I looked directly at the inner ring. At Counselor Rien. Earth's first term is that the conclave's archive be corrected. The case will be identified by accurate description. The names of the 19 individuals lost will be added to the record. Those names will remain there permanently, as part of the archive that every conclave member and every future member species can access. I let that land. The first name on that list, I said, is Iris Cass, aged 9. I turned a page. My voice did not change. I moved on. The second term concerns infrastructure. The Conclave's Exile instrument specifies the closure of 14 FTL relay lanes connecting Earth's system to the Conclave network. Earth has no objection to the closure of those lanes. They are Conclave infrastructure, and the Conclave's right to manage them is not in question. Another page. However, Earth currently operates 31 independent FTL relay lanes, none of which intersect with or depend on Conclave infrastructure. Earth's second term is that these lanes be formally recognized under Conclave territorial law as sovereign human infrastructure, not subject to the embargo conditions or the communication blackout provisions of the Exile instrument. The chamber noise was no longer a murmur. It was a specific sound, the kind that comes from a room full of people who are recalculating. 31, I said, for anyone who had not heard the first time. None of them registered in any conclave database, all of them operational. I turned a page. The third term concerns trade. Earth currently maintains active commercial relationships with 18 species that are not conclave members. These relationships predate the Exile vote. They cover material categories including raw minerals, atmospheric processing compounds, and biological resources. Earth's third term is that these relationships be formally protected from the embargo provisions of the Exile instrument, and that the framework governing them be recognized as a legitimate commercial structure under interstellar law. I looked up. 18 partners, I said. Independent lanes. Ongoing commerce that requires neither conclave routing nor conclave authorization. I mention this not as a threat. I mention it because the Conclave's Exile instrument was written on specific assumptions about Earth's dependency, and those assumptions are not accurate, and it is not productive for either party to proceed on the basis of inaccurate assumptions. I paused. The fourth term is the most important one, I said, and it is the simplest. I turned to the final page. The Exile vote passed. It is in the record. Earth requests that it remain in the record. Not withdrawn, not expunged, suspended pending review but documented. We want every species, every current member, and every species that will one day consider joining the conclave to be able to access that record and read it. We want them to read that in the year of this vote, 847 species voted to exile a civilization for the procedural inconvenience of asking too many questions about a case that was never properly reviewed. We want them to read what came next. I closed the folder. Those are Earth's terms. They are not requests. They are conditions. The conclave has 30 days to indicate whether it intends to negotiate on the basis of these conditions. If it does not, Earth will proceed under the infrastructure and trade frameworks already in place, and the exile will be mutual, permanent, and fully documented. Counselor Rien spoke. He had been holding his composure well. It had been a professional effort, and I acknowledged it silently on a technical level. But this was the moment he could not hold past. Ambassador Cass, he said. His translation carrying through with the precise formality, the Veth collective speech patterns produced in human language. You are presenting this chamber with what amounts to a counter-framework. You are suggesting that Earth has developed independent infrastructure of significant scale without conclave knowledge or approval. You are further suggesting that this was deliberate. I looked at him. Yes, I said. That represents a significant breach of the transparency obligations that conclave members. Earth was not a full conclave member when the majority of that infrastructure was built, I said. We were an associate observer delegation. Associate observer delegations are not subject to the transparency obligations of full members. You may want to check Article 3 of the membership charter, Clause 11, specifically. He was quiet. We checked it, I said. Another pause. I let it exist for a moment. Councillor Rien, his name in that chamber at this moment. I had not used it once during the entire address. I used it now, and the shift in register was exact. 11 years ago, you and I sat in the same meeting room for 4 hours and built language together, language that described something incorrectly. I agreed to that language. I want you to understand that I have thought about that decision every single day since I made it, and I will spend whatever time I have left ensuring that the accurate language is placed into the record permanently. He did not respond. 30 days, I said. I picked up my folder. I walked out. Not quickly, not slowly. I walked the way you walk when you know exactly where you are going and have no interest in the room's reaction to your departure. Owen fell into step beside me. He said nothing until we were through the access corridor and out of the chamber's audio range. Then he said very quietly, Iris Cass, aged 9. Yes, I said. We kept walking. 6 months later, I was in Nashville, and it was autumn, and the particular smell of a Tennessee October, fallen leaves and wood smoke, and something in the soil that no atmospheric processor has ever managed to replicate, was coming through the window I had left open 3 inches above the kitchen sink. I was reading the amended archive entry on my tablet. Incident KL7741GI reclassified. Full description. Contributing factors. Determination of cause. And below the determination, in the standard documentation format the conclave uses for named individuals in closed cases, a list of 19 names. The first one was Iris Cass, aged 9, civilian transit passenger. I read it 3 times. Then I set the tablet face down on the counter and drank my coffee and looked at the window for a while. The window was showing me a maple tree that had been in the yard since before I was born. It had turned the specific orange red that only happens for about 8 days a year before the leaves come down, and those 8 days were, in my considered opinion, the annual argument for Tennessee that required no supporting evidence. I let it be a maple tree for a few minutes. Then I picked the tablet back up. The conclave had accepted 22 of the 24 terms. The 2 under continued discussion were, in practice, accepted. Continued discussion is the conclave's way of accepting something while preserving the procedural dignity of appearing to evaluate it. I had anticipated this. I had told Owen 6 months ago that the response would come in this format. He had written it in his notebook. The independent relay network had been formally recognized. 31 lanes, now registered in both the conclave's infrastructure database and Earth's sovereign records. The registration required a new category to be created in the conclave's classification system, because there was no existing category for independent non-conclave infrastructure operated by an associate observer species. Creating new categories is, for the conclave, a significant concession. It means the framework changed to accommodate the fact, rather than the fact being suppressed to preserve the framework. That mattered in a specific way. The trade relationships had been protected. All 18 partners were now operating under a formal commercial framework that sat alongside, not under, the conclave's trade system. 3 of the 18 had, since the original terms were presented, extended the conversation into areas that went beyond material exchange. Technology sharing, infrastructure consultation, communication protocols. The shape of something that was not quite an alliance and not quite a separate organization, but was, unmistakably, a structure. I had been careful about language. I had told Drew and Grace and Owen to be careful about language. We were not building a competing body. We were not positioning Earth as a counter to anything. We were building relationships, the same way you build any relationship, consistently, based on mutual benefit without requiring the other party to choose between you and someone else. The conclave was watching. Of course it was. The conclave always watches, in the slow, institutionalized way that very old organizations watch things that concern them. They had sent 2 formal inquiries about the structure of the 18-partner framework in the first 3 months. Both inquiries received polite, detailed, fully accurate responses that confirmed everything the conclave already knew and provided no additional information, which is a perfectly legal diplomatic response, and one that produces a very specific kind of frustration in an organization accustomed to full visibility into everything it considers relevant. I was comfortable with that frustration. The ships were still out there. The quiet ones, positioned at the navigational choke points the conclave had never mapped because the conclave had not believed there was anything in those sectors worth mapping. We had not announced them. We had not moved them. They were not a secret. They could be detected by any species with the appropriate equipment. But they had not been the subject of a formal inquiry, which told me that the conclave had made a decision about which conversations to prioritize this season. The Exile vote was still in the record. Suspended as I had requested, not withdrawn, there permanent with the full documentation of what had been proposed and what had followed. Arbiter Voss had personally noted in the formal session minutes that the suspension was subject to periodic review. I had no objection to periodic review. Reviews were documentation. Documentation was the point. Every species that joined the conclave, now or in the future, would have access to that record. They would read it. They would read 847-1. They would read what the terms were. They would read what humanity had built while the vote was being taken. I hope some of them found it educational. The doorbell sounded at 10 in the morning, which I already knew was Owen, because Owen is exactly the type of person who arrives at 10 in the morning with the particular energy of someone who has been up since 6 assembling, whatever he wants to say. I let him in. He had brought coffee from the place 2 streets over, which was the correct choice, and indicated that he wanted the conversation to go well. We sat at the kitchen table. He had his notebook, the paper one, the real pen. He set it down next to his coffee and looked at me with the expression he gets when he is deciding whether to ask a direct question or build toward it. "Ask it," I said. "Are you glad it worked?" he asked. I had been waiting for some version of this question for 6 months. Not because Owen was predictable, but because it was a reasonable question, and reasonable questions are inevitable. I drank some coffee. I thought about it genuinely, the way you think about questions that deserve genuine answers rather than the ones you prepared. "It did not work," I said. "It produced an outcome. Those are different things." He looked at me. "That sounds like a technical distinction." "It is the accurate one," I said. "Worked implies that the situation resolved, that things are better than they were. The archive entry is corrected. The name is there. The trade framework is operating. The lanes are recognized. All of that is true and all of that matters." I looked at my coffee cup. "And also 19 people are still gone. And the review that should have happened 11 years ago did not happen. And the case file that should have said what it said was silent for 11 years, because I agreed to language I should not have agreed to." Owen was quiet. "I agreed to that language because I was 23 days past losing Iris, and I was still in the room, and I needed to stay in the room because leaving would have meant losing every piece of standing I had built over years, and I made a calculation. A professional calculation. And I have thought about that calculation every day since." "You changed it," Owen said. "Eventually." "Eventually," I said. "Is that not enough?" I looked at the maple tree through the window. It was losing leaves now. The 8 days were almost over. "I do not think enough is the right measure," I said. "It is done. It is accurate. That is what it is." He wrote something in his notebook. I watched him write without reading it. He has a right to his own notes. "The 18 partners," he said. "Grace thinks the number will be 25 by next year." "Grace is probably right," I said. "Grace is right about most things she commits to in writing. 30 by the year after." Possibly. And the conclave is going to watch that number grow, and they are going to have a formal conversation about it at some point. He looked at me. How does that conversation go? I thought about it. I thought about Counselor Rien in the inner ring, with his composure and his 400 years of institutional confidence, looking up at me through glass he had installed, and then watching me walk onto the same floor as everyone else. That conversation goes the way all conclave conversations eventually go, I said. Someone maps the situation as it currently exists. Someone maps the situation as they preferred it to exist, and both parties decide which parts of the gap between those two maps they can live with. And if they cannot live with parts of it, then we keep talking, I said. That is what diplomacy is. It is not agreement. It is the decision to keep talking instead of the alternative. He nodded slowly. He wrote another note. He capped the pen and looked at me over his coffee. She would have been 21 this year, he said. He had never said that before. He had known about Iris for 4 years, had understood the full context of why the archive clause came first, had been in the room when I said her name in front of the conclave chamber, and he had never once referenced her directly in conversation with me. I looked at him. Yes, I said, she would have. I do not have a way to say anything useful about that, he said, so I am not going to try. I just wanted to say that I know it was her first. I was quiet for a moment. I know you know, I said. And I know it is not finished for you, he said. Even with the record corrected, even with everything, I know it does not close like that. I looked out the window. The maple was losing the last of its orange red. In another week it would be bare, and the yard would look different, and then it would be winter, and then spring, and then the leaves would come back and do the 8 days again, and there would be another October. There are always more Octobers. I appreciated him for not asking me if I was okay. I have never had much patience for that question in its casual form, not because people mean badly by it, but because it tends to require an answer that is not the true one. The true answer to that question is complicated and partial and changes depending on the hour. Owen understood this without being told. That is one of the reasons I kept him. Tell me about the secondary framework draft, I said. Grace mentioned it was further along than expected. He picked up his notebook again. He found the right page. He started talking about the secondary framework draft, the preliminary structure for the expanded partner network, the communication protocols, the technology exchange clauses that Drew had spent 3 months carefully wording, so they were accurate without being more than the situation currently warranted. I listened. I asked questions. I made notes on my tablet in the file I kept updated. The file was still called Terms. Not because I was planning another confrontation. Not because I expected the situation to deteriorate. It was called Terms because that is what everything is at the core. Conditions. Conditions under which one thing continues to exist alongside another. Every relationship, every agreement, every morning cup of coffee with a deputy who arrived at 10 with a notebook and the kind of quiet steadiness that makes a team function, all of it is terms. You set them. You hold them. You update them as the situation changes. You do not let someone else set them for you and call it inevitable. Owen stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he took the empty coffee cups to the sink and rinsed them without being asked. He put on his coat. He picked up his notebook. At the door, he said goodbye with the particular ease of someone who knows they will be back in a week and is already thinking about what they want to bring to the next conversation. I closed the door. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a texture, something you can press your hand against. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while. The maple was down to a few last leaves. The yard below it was covered in what had fallen, all that red-orange laid out on the grass like something left deliberately. In 31 directions, human ships were moving through human-built lanes. In 18 systems, active commerce was flowing through frameworks that had not existed 4 years ago. In one archive, on every database in the Conclave's network, a case file had been corrected and a name had been added. In the conclave chamber, the exile vote sat in the record, suspended, permanent, a document. I had a meeting at 2 o'clock, a preliminary call with the lead representative of the 19th prospective partner. A civilization in the outer reaches that the conclave had filed under non-priority development, too small and too new to warrant much attention. I had read their briefing document 3 times. I found them interesting. They had a non-standard approach to atmospheric resource management that Drew thought was worth understanding in depth. They had asked for the meeting. I found that significant. The species that ask for the meeting are always the ones worth talking to. I turned away from the window. I poured the last of the coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table with my tablet and opened the briefing document for the 19th prospective partner and started making notes. The maple stood outside the window, bare now, doing what bare trees do in October, waiting for what comes next. I did not look at it again. I had work to do.